Mr. Penney's Aerial Submarine by E.J. Rath. Again did Theocritus Penney lay down his hammer, so that he might divert both hands to the mopping of his forehead. Mechanically he drew a soiled forefinger along the broad, perpendicular expanse between his eyebrows and his faded brown hair, and then, with a flirt of his wrist, caused it to snap smartly against his thumb and middle finger. After that he took a red handkerchief from his hip pocket and completed the work. "It's hot, all right," he said aloud. Particularly was it hot in the back lot, where he sat astride of a tubular thing whose iron plates made the air quiver with their radiation. "But it'll be cool down there," added Theocritus, with a friendly glance at the pond that lay lifeless, only a little way off. Then he resumed the hammer, beating noisily and happily on the resounding plates. Now and again he would pause long enough to squint, alternately with each eye, at the sea lion. She was shaping fast. It was altogether likely that she would be ready in a week. Theocritus Penney hoped so, at any rate, because there was no prospect of a let-up in the hot spell. He longed for the inviting coolness of the pond, where he knew there were quiet and comfort, and, best of all, vindication. He felt the need of vindication, especially in the eyes of Mrs. Penney. There was nothing optimistic or imaginative about Mrs. Penney. Although she admitted that the sea lion might go down, probably would, she entertained no hope that it would come up again. Cleaving to that opinion, she was unable to figure how she would be able to keep the farm going, besides keeping house and taking care of 5 children. "Of course," she would say bitterly, "it is all right for you to spend your days hammering on top of that thing and cracking all our eardrums to pieces, but it's not digging potatoes, nor hoeing corn, nor educating your children." When she said anything like this, Theocritus would gaze compassionately upon his offspring, collectively known in the Sprigsville school as the nickel, sigh softly, pick up a hoe, a shovel, or a rake, whichever was nearest, and work the farm. But if Mrs. Penney was called away to the village, something stronger than his own will would decoy him to the back lot, thrust into his hand his ear-splitting hammer, and set him astride of the sea lion, where, amid the waving billows of uncut hay, he would resume the building of his fortune. Mr. Penney was not indigenous to Sprigsville. He properly belonged in the city, where he made boilers for a living. The country got him merely because the city would not give his lungs a fair chance. Nobody knew better than Theocritus his shortcomings as a tiller of the soil. That is, nobody except his wife. She came from a place where people farmed. She made no particular objection when he built himself a little workshop in the barn, because she thought it would make him more content with his new lot. It was only when Theocritus invested all the cash reserve in a load of second-hand sheet iron that she indicated her disapproval. And when Mrs. Penney indicated anything, no explanations were required. Sheet iron could neither be cooked, made into children's clothes, nor employed as a fertilizer for an impoverished earth, however durable it might be. And in Mr. Penney's investment she could see nothing but a harking back to the things which she hoped had been left behind. He was very meek about it all, and tended the farm for almost a week after the sheet iron had been stowed away in the barn, in a contrite effort to restore to the treasury that which had been taken from it. But all the while Theocritus had ideas. The sea lion was really an afterthought. In the line of descent she was a granddaughter. Her original ancestor was a turbine engine by which Theocritus planned to produce an untold amount of power with so little coal that the fuel problem was too silly to consider. The turbine was outwardly a plain cylinder, very neatly riveted. Nobody could beat Theocritus at riveting. His engine was almost finished when he learned that nobody in Sprigsville burned coal, mainly because there was no coal yard in the village, and that it would cost a year's farming to obtain enough coal for a proper series of experiments. Then, too, there was nothing in Sprigsville that needed to be run by a turbine anyhow. So the turbine became father to a water motor, and the transition from a structural standpoint was quite easy. But Sprigsville was also barren of water power, and there was nothing to be hoped for from the lazy pond in the back lot. Mr. Penney was not dismayed, because he had ideas in reserve. For a few days he contemplated the employment of solar energy, but he soon acquired a distaste for that because his wife was insistent that the only kind of solar energy that would be tolerated around the place was that which made things grow. So he was virtually forced to the building of the sea lion. It was plain to him that there was an enormous demand for submarines. The United States and the world at large clamored for them. Not for the militant or defensive things that were as likely to remain on the bottom as come to the top, but for the safe, reliable, commercially economic, and practical ones. That was the word that Theocritus liked, practical. Mrs. Penney sniffed at this clamor of the world, and set against it the requirements of the Penney family, as estimated in vegetables, cordwood, and shoes for the children. "But don't you see, I'm going to get all of them things," said Mr. Penney. She did not see, but nevertheless she could not keep the sea lion from coming into being. Even before Theocritus took out the ends of his water motor, he had her named. Sea lions lived out of the water, on it, and in it. And what more appropriate than that she should be built out of it, launched upon it, and plunged under it? He built her somewhat after some pictures he had seen, but with improvements. She was not more than 20 feet long, and when he put tapering ends on her, she looked like a fat pointed egg. In her middle he cut a manhole big enough to admit his body, and inside of her he built tanks. He made a keel for her so that she would ride with the manhole uppermost, and he manufactured a propeller that could be worked from the inside by hand power. All these things he performed with much devotion and pains. The Penney children were highly pleased, too, for each one of them had the promise of a dip into the depths of the pond in the back lot, into which they had as yet been unable to fall without getting wet. Naturally, Spriggsville kept an eye on the progress of the sea lion. A considerable part of it went down to the Penney farm on the day set for the launching and trial trip, where it sat on the fence, saying little, and watching Theocritus giving his heart's desire the final loving attentions. It was not until the sea lion seemed reluctant to leave the ways that anybody volunteered to lend a hand. She did not slide, as Mr. Penney had planned, but had to be pried into the pond, a tiny American flag waving bravely at her prow. The nickel were the only persons who cheered. The sea lion rode like a cork, yet steadily, because her keel kept her from such frivolities as turning turtle. Mr. Penney could scarcely be blamed for a pleasant feeling of vanity as he shoved off in a skiff and towed her out to the center of the pond. The Spriggsville people who had assisted in the immersion sat on the bank and watched him clamber up her round side after he had hitched the skiff to a ringbolt. It looked a good deal like riding a barrel when Mr. Penney bestrode the sea lion, but this appearance was speedily dissipated when he slipped down through the manhole and stood for a moment with only his head and shoulders visible. He waved his hands, and the nickel cheered again. Mrs. Penney came out of the back door of the house, but when she saw that the children were safe, she disappeared again, thereby disclosing the extent of her interest in the matter. With a final wave of his hand, Mr. Penney sank from sight through the manhole and drew the cover over his head. The Spriggsville people could distinctly hear him clamping it down, and a few shook their heads. Then the sea lion rocked gently, and they knew that Mr. Penney was moving about in her, preparing for the descent. The secret of this descent he had disclosed to nobody except his children, who were really too young to appreciate it. In places where they had shipping, it might not have been a secret, but Spriggsville was not maritime, and was, therefore, mystified. Yet it was all quite simple. Mr. Penney would simply admit water into the tanks, and down he would go. As she rode now, the propeller of the sea lion was more than a foot above the water, but the tank capacity would soon remedy that. Mr. Penney had built the tanks large, for he rightly estimated that the sea lion was almost as buoyant as a big rubber ball, and this left very little room for himself and the crank which worked the propeller. He did not mind, however, being cramped for a while. The trickle of the water in the tanks was music to him. Very gently the sea lion began to settle in the water. The Spriggsville people stood up, inversely as she went down. They watched her until her propeller almost touched the surface, and then the descending movement ceased. Presently the brass pinwheel at the stern began to revolve jerkily. then more steadily and faster as the navigator warmed up, but all the while it was exerting its power against the air, being quite clear of the element in which Mr. Penney had intended it to work. He did not start the propeller until the sound of inflowing water had ceased, and if Sprigsville could have looked through the iron sides of the sea lion, it would have seen him perspiring and puffing and hopeful. But even Mr. Penney, despite his unfavorable point of view, soon became conscious that the sea lion was not moving ahead. There was a lack of resistance as he bent heroically to the task of grinding the crank. It went around so fast that he could hardly keep pace with it. He decided that it would be well to look about before he ran her into some hidden reef. That, of course, on the supposition that she might be moving ahead after all. For the purpose of taking observations, he had provided a little glass window in the coaming of the manhole, and now he straightened up and took a peep. The first thing that met his gaze was the placid surface of the pond, and then beyond it he saw the familiar landscape. This was certainly odd, for what he really expected to see was the fauna and flora of his private lake. The interior of the sea lion was stuffy, and he decided to get a breath of fresh air. There was a murmur from the bank as Mr. Penney's head emerged from the manhole, and he looked about. First he swept the horizon with a disappointed glance, and then he craned his neck and gazed over the side. The sea lion was still riding high and securely. He could see at a glance that she had not moved. Yet he was sure that the water tanks were full, and that puzzled him. "Ain't you going down?" inquired a voice from the bank. "Oh, yes," replied Mr. Penney. "I'm just getting my bearings." Then he vanished again, and the trapdoor slammed noisily. After an interval of 5 minutes the lid rose for a second time, and immediately reappeared the head of the navigator. "Got to enlarge her water tanks," observed Mr. Penney, addressing nobody in particular. Yet he wondered how he was going to do it and still leave room for himself. Silence followed for half a minute, to be broken by the voice of the eldest citizen of Sprigsville. "What you want to enlarge," said he, "is the bottom of the pond." Mr. Penney stared at him. "What do you mean?" he asked huskily. "You're on the bottom," said the eldest citizen briefly. Mr. Penney's expression plainly indicated his doubt. "There ain't more'n 3 foot of water in any part of this here pond," added the voice from the bank, as its owner turned slowly on his heel and started up the hill to the road. Sprigsville followed him, grinning amiably. From his post in the manhole, Mr. Penney watched his fellow citizens trudge up the hill. When the last one had disappeared over the top of the rise, he looked over the side of the sea lion cautiously. The water told him nothing, for it was brown and murky. He climbed out on the deck and slid off into the skiff, where he seized an oar and thrust it downward over the side. Half its length was still above the surface when the mud on the bottom refused to swallow any more of it. There was something drooping in Mr. Penney's figure when he pulled out the oar, almost with an air of impatience, and cast off the skiff. Then he made a little voyage, criss-crossing the pond and circumnavigating it, and every little while plunging the oar downward. After half an hour he agreed with the eldest citizen of Sprigsville. There was no doubt that Mr. Penney's pond made no demand for the services of a submarine. He rested his oars and viewed the sea lion, which lay perfectly still and docile, her flag gently waving at the prow, her manhole yawning to the sky, and her propeller looking very obliging but impotent as it glistened in the sunset. "There's something useful all gone to pot," observed Mr. Penney with a sigh. "I certainly can't afford to get this pond dredged." He heard Mrs. Penney calling from the house and rowed ashore, where the nickel met him and escorted him. "If you're all through fooling for the day," said Mrs. Penney, "I want some potatoes." "Yes, Myra," said Mr. Penney quietly. He dug a dozen potatoes in silence, and then a second dozen, and a third to the accompaniment of a joyful whistle. Mrs. Penney came to the door and looked at him suspiciously when the whistling began, because she knew that it did not bode any good. She recognized it as a symptom of Theocritus's desire to get back to the workshop. "I hope," she said when Theocritus brought in the potatoes, "that you've thrown that business to the 4 winds of heaven." Mr. Penney looked at her mildly for a few seconds. "That's just what I'm going to do, Myra," he said slowly. The next time a Sprigsville citizen visited the Penney farm, he found that the sea lion had come out of the pond. Mr. Penney had accomplished this difficult feat unaided, save by a homemade windlass, and now he had her high and dry. In fact, she hung clear of the ground, either end resting on a scaffolding. Mr. Penney was engaged in boring a hole in the underside and was having a breathless time of it. Mr. Bumble, his visitor, watched for some time before speaking, as if casting about for a suitable remark. "Too bad about that there pond," he ventured at last. "Best thing that ever happened," said Mr. Penney cheerfully. "I'm glad you're coming round to look at things that way," said Mr. Bumble. "We don't like to have no drownin' cases round Sprigsville, and they ain't much call for anything besides skiffs anyhow." Mr. Penney smiled mystically and crawled out from under his invention so that he could converse more comfortably. "Mr. Bumble," he said, "I'm a fortunate man." Mr. Bumble nodded, although he did not understand. "The depth of that pond was made just for the purpose of keepin' me from throwin' away fame and fortune," added Mr. Penney. "Goin' to farm now, are you?" said Mr. Bumble, who was pitiably devoid of imagination. Mr. Penney ignored the remark and replied, impressively and irrelevantly, "Transportation, Mr. Bumble, transportation." "What do you mean about transportation?" "Why, it's the thing. It's everything. Railroads, steamships, wagons, horses, ox teams, people's legs. Everything's transportation. Understand?" Mr. Bumble looked at his legs, which for 60 years had transported him acceptably, and nodded. "The theory of the world," said Mr. Penney, sitting down on a box and emphasizing his words with his forefinger, "is movin' things round from one place to another. That's what people get rich at, movin' things. That's transportation, and those that can provide it quick and cheap and safe are going to get rich in spite of all they can do to prevent it. I tried submarine transportation. That's all right. It's a business proposition. She was a success." And Mr. Penney jerked his thumb in the direction of his craft. "No doubt about it, she was a success. But she never had no chance in this pond. And it's a blessed good thing she didn't, because, Mr. Bumble, she's been saved by kind Providence for a greater field. The bottom of that there pond fooled me, I admit. I didn't have no room to do what I wanted to do." Mr. Penney turned his gaze upward and pointed at the sky above him. "But there ain't nothing can cheat me out of plenty of room up there," he said, and he looked at Mr. Bumble in such a knowing way that the gentleman fell into immediate confusion. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Aerial transportation," cried Mr. Penney. Mr. Bumble looked at the sea lion, then at her author, and then he shook his head. "I don't catch on," he said. Mr. Penney arose and took his visitor by the arm. He led him around under the overhanging stern of the iron craft and pointed upward. "SEABIRD," spelled Mr. Bumble aloud. "I only had to paint out 3 letters," said Mr. Penney in a pleased tone. "I was going to call her Sea Gull, but then by calling her Sea Bird I could save the I out of the other name. Besides, it made the name kinder more general and impressive. Does it suggest anything to you, Mr. Bumble?" That gentleman shook his head stupidly. "Think," said Mr. Penney. "It has a meanin'. Sea lions swim in the water, don't they? Well, what do sea birds do?" "They swim in it too?" said Mr. Bumble, brightening. "They fly!" shouted Mr. Penney, almost losing his patience. Mr. Bumble's jaw dropped, and he regarded Mr. Penney with serious eyes. "You don't expect to fly in that there sheet-iron business?" he demanded. "I do," said Mr. Penney calmly. "Inside of it?" "No, underneath it." "Hanging on to it?" "Riding in a car," said Mr. Penney loftily. "I never seen a balloon made out of sheet-iron," said Mr. Bumble. "They build 'em out of cloth or paper or something light." "Yes, that is the old-fashioned way," said Mr. Penney graciously, "but it ain't my way." "But how are you going to make sheet iron fly?" demanded Mr. Bumble. "Now that you ask, I don't mind tellin'," said Mr. Penney, sitting down on the box again. "There ain't no problem in making airships float. Gas'll do that. The thing is to get speed out of 'em. If you try to drive these here flimsy ones more'n 25 or 30 miles an hour, they'll bust. Cloth won't stand it. They just crumple up. Why? 'Cause of the wind resistance. They can't stand being pushed against the wind. Now, if you want to get high speed out of airships, they got to stand wind pressure. Paper won't do it. Silk won't do it. What you want is something that won't cave in when you're going a couple of 100 miles an hour, or maybe a little faster. Hence," and Mr. Penney poised his finger impressively, "iron airships." "But you can't get enough gas into that thing to lift a fly," expostulated Mr. Bumble. "A popular error," said Mr. Penney. "Merely a popular error. This is right where my invention comes in. The reason you have to make them cloth balloons so big is to get enough gas into 'em to float. So much gas to so much weight, and the gas takes up a terrible lot of room. The thing is to get all the gas you want without taking up too much room, and the way to do that is compress your gas." Mr. Penney paused to watch the effect of his words, and then resumed, "Of course, a child knows you can't compress gas into a silk bag 'thout busting the bag, but you couldn't bust that, could you?" And Mr. Penney hit the fat side of the seabird a resounding whack. "Yes," he added thoughtfully, "I figure there's a very large fortune in it. You see, it don't cost much. No railroad tracks to lay, no roads to build, no channels to dredge, just air and plenty of it, and that don't cost nothin'." But as Mr. Bumble went off muttering, Mr. Penney knew that the initial cost of the seabird was indeed a very serious matter, particularly if Mrs. Penney got an inkling of it. The ship herself was economical enough because he intended to keep the propeller and the steering and diving rudders just as they were. But there was the gas. Spriggsville had no gasworks. It burned kerosene and cordwood. Mr. Penney had to manufacture his own gas, and the raw material would cost him 2 or 3 weeks' labor on the farm. He ordered the materials from the city without saying anything about it to his wife, and when they came he smuggled them into the barn. It took quite a while to contrive a compressor, but he finally built one out of an old air pump and set about the task of filling the seabird with the elixir of life. It was a tedious and ill-smelling job, for some of the gas was bound to escape no matter how careful he was, and it was a positively back-breaking task to compress it. He had to work by hand power only. Every little while he would go all over the seams of the seabird with a lighted candle to make sure there were no leaks. Before he began to fill her, he took the precaution to tie her fast to the earth, for he did not want her sailing out of the back lot until he was ready to get aboard. He passed stout ropes over her, fore and aft, and fastened them to deeply driven stakes. He planned to give the seabird a reserve supply of buoyancy. When he started, he would let her shoot up straight for 5 or 6 miles, and then, if he found the air too rarefied, he would let out some gas and seek a more comfortable level. He figured that she would navigate best at the height of 1 mile or so, because that would give him a free sailing radius of several 100 miles. Nothing within that area stood more than 1 mile above ground, not even Bullhead Mountain. The day of the start found Spriggsville again at the Penney farm, watching Mr. Penney making the final preparations. He told off 4 assistants who were to let go the ropes when he gave the signal, and he cautioned them not to get entangled when the seabird shot skyward at the instant of her release. The frail, lattice-like car that hung from the underbody of Mr. Penney's airship quivered alarmingly as he took his seat in it, but he assured the Spriggsville folks that it was quite strong enough to carry him. He tried the propeller and the rudder and found them working perfectly. The crowd gathered closer as the final moment approached. Mr. Penney's assistants loosened the ropes from the stakes, each keeping a hitch around a peg that could be let go when the word came. The nickel stood in a row, wide-eyed. "Are you ready?" called Mr. Penney. Yep, said the assistants in concert. 1, counted Mr. Penney. The men at the ropes braced their feet. 2, you could have heard a feather drop. 3, Mr. Penney's 4 assistants cast loose their hitches and jumped back smartly. The forward rope slipped over the nose of the seabird and fell to the ground. The after one also slid off her rounded back, but it caught on the propeller and hung in a loop. The seabird seemed instinctively to know that this was not right, for she did not move. Mr. Penney glanced over his shoulder and saw in an instant what the trouble was. "Cast off that rope!" he shouted. "Quick!" A score of Sprigsville citizens jumped forward. Half of them seized one end of the rope, and half laid hold of the other. Simultaneously they bent their backs to the task of releasing the seabird from bondage. The rope tautened, and the seabird quivered. "Hey, there!" yelled Mr. Penney. The crowd pulled harder, and more people joined it. "No, no!" roared Mr. Penney, standing up in the car. "Let go of—" The seabird trembled violently, and the aeronaut was shaken back into his seat. There was a groaning of timbers, then a splintering. Sprigsville gave a final mighty heave, each group that held one end of the rope determined not to be outpulled by the other. "Stop!" cried Mr. Penney. "That ain't—" The remainder of the sentence was lost in a crashing of wood. The scaffolding under the seabird swayed and toppled, and the fat, black body of Mr. Penney's airship hit the ground stern first. Her propeller bit deep into the soil, and she seemed to poise for an instant, her nose skyward, as if irresolutely considering her course. Then she rolled over on her side with a hollow bump, rocked backward and forward 2 or 3 times, and came to a rest. They unravelled Mr. Penney from the timbers and propped him up against the side of the seabird. He was very white and shaky, but he did not appear to bear the marks of serious damage. Slowly he passed his hand across his forehead, as if trying to recollect something. Then the contact of the iron body of the seabird awakened him with a start. "Hey, you! Quick!" he called tremulously. "Get up on her there, some of you. Don't let her get away." A dozen citizens of Sprigsville swarmed over the seabird and sat astride of her, so that she might not leave the earth without Mr. Penney. "Now make fast them ropes again," he ordered. "Ah, what's the use?" said a man who sat amidships, dangling his legs. "They ain't no gas into her." "How's that?" demanded Mr. Penney sharply. "Why, look a-here," said the citizen, and he thrust his arm up to the shoulder into the manhole of the seabird. I couldn't have left that open," said Mr. Penney, flushing. "Seems to me I remember closing that." "Don't believe she ever had any gas into her," said the citizen cheerfully, as he bent his nose over the manhole and sniffed. "They ain't no smell of gas." Mr. Penney fumbled for his bandana and wiped his face. He tried his legs and found that they carried him, although somewhat unsteadily. He viewed his fellow citizens with an air that indicated mild resentment. Then his eyes wandered over the wreck of the scaffolding and the wounded seabird lying inert, and he drew a deep breath. Finally he gazed at the skeptical man who was still sniffing at the manhole. "All kinds of gas don't smell," said Mr. Penney contemptuously. "You come down often there." That was as near to being angry as anybody ever saw the inventor of the aerial submarine. "There ain't going to be no ascension today," he added suggestively, "so I guess none of you gentlemen needs to wait." Sprigsville remembered its dignity and withdrew, leaving Mr. Penney alone with the seabird and the nickel. It was a week before even Mr. Bumble called around at the Penney farm. He discovered a surprising thing right in the backyard of the house. There was a great hole in the ground, and in it lay the seabird. Her yawning manhole, its cover removed, came flush with the level of the ground. Mr. Penney was busy with a shovel filling it around her. Mr. Bumble viewed the scene with a puzzled air for a moment, and then his face cleared. "I've read 'bout them subways," he began. Mrs. Penney stepped out of the back door and regarded him with displeasure. "Maybe you've read 'bout cisterns, too," she said, and then she turned on her heel and disappeared. Mr. Penney climbed out of the excavation and led Mr. Bumble around the side of the house. "I'm a-going to let her use it for a cistern for a while. It won't hurt it none," he said in a half-whisper. "But what you just said 'bout subways sets me a-thinkin'. There's something in that, Mr. Bumble. Yes, sir, I believe there's a fortune into it. Why, just think a minute, a subway running from here to—" Mr. Bumble hurriedly disengaged his arm. "I got to do a errand in the village," he said. End of Mr. Penney's Aerial Submarine by E. J. Rath. Read by Ted Perkins